and welcome to In Spiral Out Loud, where we are exploring ways of creating a thriving future for humanity and all sentient beings. So today, Mars and I had planned to do a discussion around the health system. The health system around medicine, pharmaceuticals, all sorts of different things. And we've just been chatting for the last hour and realizing we've got more than enough for actually probably a movie. So we're not going to have the discussion we were going to have, or you guys are never going to get any sleep. We're just going to talk a little bit about some of that today. Anyway, hi Mars, how are you going?
Hi Tony, I'm all right.
All right, excellent.
Keeping busy. Yeah, how are you going?
I'm good, keeping busy too. We have been going through all of the bits and pieces that we're going to be chatting about eventually. Vaccines, 5G, food, pharmaceuticals, GMOs, chemtrails, technology, like the whole thing around health and medicine is so massive. So without actually getting into all of those bits today, we thought we'd actually just get straight to why it's manipulated, how it's manipulated. And I'm pretty much just going to hand this over to Mars now, because you mentioned something recently called the Great Work.
Yeah, the Great Work. That's a big sort of exploration into the world of the movers and shakers. And the central theme to that is a philosophy that comes out of a hybrid and mishmash of many different traditions and their understanding of a spiritual and material world idea of how everything works, how the universe works, and our place within it. So it's sort of, a lot of it comes out of Kabbalistic thought, but there's also elements of it in Eastern traditions, and has sort of culminated as a consequence of these different traditions merging together as cultures have drifted and moved throughout the world over centuries and millennia. And some of it has been preserved, but a lot of it has also been distorted over time. But the central theme to most of these sort of ideas is the concept of duality, meaning a dark and a light, a positive and a negative, male and female. All of the dualistic concepts that we have basically stem out of this philosophy. And there are strong connections with religions, but it's sort of, if you can imagine, there's always a covert and overt version of religion. It's always been that way, with one exception that I know of, and that was very ancient Egypt.
Could you perhaps just quickly explain what covert and overt are in relation to religion?
Sure. So we have our overt religions being, you know, the dominant religions, Catholicism, Judaism, Buddhism, and so on. They're all overt religions, meaning we can all see them. But there's the covert element to all of them, and that is sort of the secret, arcane knowledge that form the basis of those public religions. That is the covert. You might also consider them to be esoteric. And that philosophy that pulls together in a public way is a sort of a dumbed down version of occult knowledge. And in history, that was not necessarily specifically by design. It was more to do with most people couldn't read and write hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It was sort of privileged skills that you had if you could do that. usually the sort of wealthier families and the ones that had the time to learn to read and write while everyone else was off farming and breaking their backs to support the rich. And we've all heard the term knowledge is power, and that cannot be more true than the world of the occult. There's a few sort of phrases floating around. One of them would be in the land of the blind, the one-eyed king, the one-eyed man is king. Well, another way to look at that is esoteric knowledge, because a lot of it is to do with how we work in terms of how our spirit and our body combine into a way that we can basically take greater control over our own destinies, but also those of other people if they don't have the same knowledge. So, like, for example, NLP is a classic one in the public domain. That's becoming more popular in recent times, but 20 years ago, very few people knew what that was. And for those who don't know, neuro-linguistic programming is the kind of language that is used to plant thoughts, to manipulate people without them even being aware of it. And it's done through language predominantly.
And it can also be used as a healing tool as well, but like all tools, it has its weaponization.
That's right. And well, when I use the word manipulation, it doesn't necessarily imply negatively, although you generally associate it with a negative term, but it's just manipulation for positive or negative. So back to the covert and overt religions. Well, that philosophy, while it in a sort of a more religious context, it really is about balance. Like even Jesus mentioned the middle path or the middle way. That is an understanding of the balance of two opposing forces coming into balance in harmony in a middle path. You could symbolically look at the dark and the light pathways, which is one is service to self, one is service to others. The service to others would be the light pillar, and the service to self would be the black pillar. You'll see that symbology prolifically. Particularly, you'll see it represented as two pillars of an entrance to a temple, one painted black, one painted white. And of course, you walk through the two pillars, symbolically meaning the middle path or the middle way. Now, that's all good and well in theory, because it seems sensible. You know, if you're completely in service to yourself, well, you know, that just results in materialism, egotism, and all the nasties that we don't like to be. But if you're entirely service to others, then if you take that to its extreme, you end up depriving yourself to the point where basically you fall apart. So the middle way is, yeah. So the trick is to, of course, have the balance of the two, and that takes experience and wisdom to achieve it. The problem with these kind of philosophies is they've been adopted by the darker forces of manipulators in the world, to the point where they believe that there is a necessity for this good and evil in the world for us as a culture, as an entire race, to evolve. And the dark side.
Sorry, when you talk about the duality, like how are you talking hundreds or thousands of years that idea has kind of been set in place?
That idea has probably been around since the beginning of language, but it's evolved over time. The problem is it has evolved in a very dark way, and it basically has set up a type of philosophy where it leads people to believe that only those that have this knowledge, this understanding of not only the dark and the light, the good and the evil in the world and in the universe, but all sorts of other knowledge about our spirit, our soul, what it is, what it's for, why we're here. All of that knowledge has morphed into extremism, where everything is justified because of the long-term millennia goal of the evolution of mankind. But unfortunately, the Dark Ones have basically taken this to be a license to do whatever they like at the expense of everybody. And if we just sit back and allow it, then that's our own silly fault. And there's no repercussions for them, because part of the way they operate is they understand karma all too well. It's not like they're thoroughly evil and don't have any concepts of what our soul is. They know full well we all have souls. They know full well we have spirit. And they understand the concepts of karma very well. So they find loopholes to get around it.
Is this where the
Because
whole idea of consent is?
Yes, it's vital. So if they send men off to war, well, as far as they're concerned, that was their choice to go to war. They committed murder. There's no two ways about this. It's murder. It doesn't matter if it's sanctioned by a government or a king or a pope or whoever. It's still murder. There's no justification for it. But they wash their hands of responsibility by saying, you volunteered for this, even if the choice is conscription, or in the old days, or being put in jail. It's still a choice. But the other part of that is they always announce what they're going to do. You will always find evidence beforehand of what they're about to do, even if it's veiled in a gazette in some little newspaper in the middle of nowhere that no one ever reads. As far as they're concerned, they've told you. And if you don't complain, you've given consent. It's the same concept that goes into law and legislation. It's always the same thing. It's always about consent. So the difference between law and legislation, and this ties into the great work, is law is that which is designated by what people would refer to as God, in the sense of a universal consciousness, great mind, not specifically the biblical God, which I'm not entirely convinced is actually what they're referring to anyway. That's a completely different conversation. But that's basically, law is what is dictated as, these are the things you cannot do, which are basically theft or damage of life and property. Whereas all other types of what people generally call law, which is really legislation, is about licensing and permission from other people. In law, your only supreme is God itself, or the universal mind itself. That is your only authority above you, no other man or woman or child. In legislation, it's an inversion. It's almost like they ignored God. God is at the bottom of the heap, and they are above us. So that is an unfortunate repercussion of this philosophy that has stemmed out of a perversion of an ancient truth of the duality of nature and our necessity to come into harmony with all things in that balance, with respect to all things, not just people, not just to animals, but to the material world itself. We're all part of an ecosystem that needs balance desperately now. And what we're seeing in the world is the repercussions of this megalomania of wanting to control and dominate everybody under man's laws, rather than allowing people to naturally evolve.
Yeah.
Because if you think about the way people behave in modern times, this is dramatically different to every other part of history. We're just seeing people taking liberties that they would have never dreamed of in history, even if they had the opportunity, because culture and society were so very different in history. There was a respect for our fellow men and women. We didn't have these legislations. We had law, and that was enough. That was enough to keep people pretty much in line to not start abusing other people and abusing resources and nature. And now we're in a situation where everything is permitted. I mean, I even saw a few TED Talks about a year ago that were openly trying to justify pedophilia to the population, as though this was acceptable. This is the perversion that has come out of this dualistic monstrosity that has been a perversion of the great work. I think that there was a point in time where there was this great idea known as the great work that was truly to illuminate people into this knowledge, and not to steer away from God, but in fact to reinvigorate it. And it's been turned on its head in the last few centuries, progressively, to lead us into this almost satanic. I mean, I don't necessarily believe in the devil, but I can't think of a better word for it. It is purely a satanic ideology of absolute control and domination over everybody and everything.
And it's amazing how much people are actually wanting play into that now. You know, we're in this stage at the moment, so we're at the start of May, so the world's been in lockdown for about a month or a bit longer. And, you know, the number of, for instance, neighbours that are turning on each other, calling up the cops because they heard someone talking next door, so they must have a visitor. Like the need to adhere and become policemen themselves is quite phenomenal. I mean, I haven't experienced it, but I've seen other people's experiences of that via social media. Just really wanting to play the devil's advocate in that way. It's quite strange to witness.
Yeah, it's the divide and conquer strategy. It's pitting everybody against themselves so they don't actually get together and realize who's really the enemy, which is the movers and shakers that propel us into this idea that's perfectly acceptable to rat people out on each other. That's not there's no sense of brotherliness or a common humanity in that. It's all just individualism and catering to that self-centered need to be the little pet of the state by ratting each other out. It's obscene, utterly obscene.
So how does all of this relate to the area of health or lack thereof? Because you know, at the moment there's a lot of noise and fear and censorship around any discussions to do with 5G, to do with vaccinations. We've spoken at length in the past around the world of pharmaceutical-based medicine, around food, which is basically poison dressed up as something that's supposed to be edible. That's just a whole other topic in itself. But it just feels like every element of society, we need to be so vigilant to find a pathway through that is helpful, because most of the ways through are definitely not. How much of that is by design? Would you like to speak to that?
Well, it ties directly into the, I don't actually like to call it the great work, because I think it's a perversion of what was a good idea. But we'll call it the New World Order, because that really is a monstrosity, and I think that summarizes a good part of it in that terminology. The goals have been stated very blatantly by the various fraternities that I mentioned last time we spoke, where that philosophy gets embedded into people's minds when they're sort of the offspring of the elites in America in particular, but this is a worldwide phenomenon. where they get attracted to these secretive fraternities in universities, Skull and Bones being the most famous. There's a few others. Well, there's actually hundreds of others. And this is where they get these ideas of where the world should move and how they're going to influence the world in their own capacity and their future careers. And one of those fraternities released, it's been uncovered who actually finally, who commissioned the Georgia Guidestones to be built, which cost millions of dollars. And it turns out it was one of the fraternities. And their goals are pretty blatant on that monument, which is in the middle of nowhere. And the first one says maintain a population of under 500 million people worldwide. And it goes on to 500 million. And we're currently up to apparently 7.5 billion people right now, which means, of course, to achieve that goal, and it doesn't mention a timeline, but that's their stated goal. They've, as I said before, they've announced what their intentions are in a monument that's hidden in the middle of nowhere because no one ever goes near it. There's a highway driving past. Well, now how does that relate to COVID-19 and 5G and vaccinations and fluoridation and chemtrails and all of those things which are irrefutably proven at this point? All of this is tied in with creating a calamity at the end of the Great Age, because these people think in terms of millennia. They plan centuries ahead, and they work with great cycles. Now, this is where astrology comes into things. I won't go into that because we might end up deviating too far from the point, but suffice to say that at every great age, there's a calamity, a catastrophe that is designed to shake things up for the world and to prepare the world for a new coming era. And it's all, once again, tied into their exotic, constructed philosophy. And I see that this rollout of a combination of detrimental things, like the fluoride and the chemtrails and everything else I mentioned, in combination and conjunction with which would be a fairly benign kind of virus, in combination with vaccines, aluminium floating down into your lungs from the chemtrails, fluoridation, which puts poisons into your entire system, blocks up your pineal gland and your pituitary gland, which they know full well is vital to your health. This melting pot of poisons and toxins will result, if people don't learn how these things affect you, I fear will actually result in a massive calamity according to the big plan of the Great New World Order.
Yeah.
But they're manufacturing consent by announcing all of these things. Like, for example, Dr. Fauci, or as I like to call him, Dr. Faust, mentioned in 2017 that Trump will face a pandemic during his term. That was 3 years ago. How did he know that?
Yeah.
Pandemics aren't predictable, or are they? It's also interesting to look at the things that are being dramatically and very quickly censored all over YouTube and Facebook and all the other social media. The biggest hot topics that get censored, well, the first one is the most important for us here, which is the connection between, or apparent connection between 5G and coronavirus deaths.
Yeah.
That is the one that's getting stamped out. And if there was nothing to see here, they wouldn't bother stamping it out. But the speed at which they're knocking these videos off, even if there's no wording or titling mentioning COVID, they still get disappeared really fast. That means there's a big team of people whose sole purpose is to knock off any dissent from the official party line, which is COVID-19 is a natural virus, you need a vaccine, there's no other treatment, and it's going to kill you if you go outside. That's
and in my mind, that consent that you talk about is just people going, Yeah, sure. Shove a vaccine in my arm so I can go to a festival again, or so I can jump on a plane again. Like it's just another way of generating that false sense of consent. Where can people go to find out more info, or what can people do to educate themselves more on this kind of blanket control?
Well, it only takes a very brief Google search, really, to look at what the New World Order is and what the Great Work is. Um, the movers and shakers have been very open about it in recent times. Um, I've even seen, all the mainstream press at one time or another talking about the New World Order. We've had public statements by the likes of Henry Kissinger, who's a very important character politically because he's been behind the scenes for decades, as opposed to an elected president who has a 4 or 8 year term and that's it. And he said when Obama was in power, when the 2008 crash hit, um, Obama could use this. I'd have to paraphrase it, but he basically was implying that Obama could use this catastrophe to further the agenda of the New World Order. There was Gordon Brown in the UK around the time George Bush was in power, talking about a New World Order, and very vehement, like he was very excited about this New World Order. So many presidents have talked about it. Many presidents have warned about it, not necessarily using that terminology, the New World Order, but Eisenhower warned about it, JFK warned about it, and they called it the military-industrial complex. Well, that's just another way of saying the New World Order. That's just a mechanism to implement it in military terms and economic terms. But there's so much information out there on this that really just start Google searching. And well, actually, I don't really recommend Google anymore. I prefer to use DuckDuckGo because, they're certainly at least got a public statement about it being a private search. Whether that's true or not is another story. As far as 5G goes, well, there are actually ways to dig up even classified or declassified documents from the likes of the CIA. If you go into their library archives and you start searching for terms like electromagnetic radiation, and then add the word health or effects, you'll actually find that there are dozens of research papers that have been declassified specifically talking about using EMFs in different frequencies, i.e. 5G and Wi-Fi, as a weapons technology. 5G is actually just one step shy in terms of frequency bandwidth of being classified as a weapon.
Yeah. And how old are these papers?
Some of them are from the 1960s. Some of them are more recent.
Yeah.
So they've known about this for a very long time. In fact, part of the research came about from looking at radar. So that's even earlier. That's during the Second World War.
Yeah, and in the INTJ video that I was watching last night, I'll put a link to that in the YouTube description underneath this video. Robert Steele, he was a former CIA spy, and he was saying absolutely, like there's no doubt about it that the COVID-19 has been weaponized, and he absolutely directly links that through to 5G and states that that 5G will turn what hasn't really been into a pandemic into an absolute pandemic, because the unrolling of that will basically activate the technology that is inherent in. I'm not quite sure if it's inherent within the virus itself or in the vaccines, but he goes into that in some detail. So we'll definitely chat about more about that in future too.
Yeah, there's a lot to unravel with that whole story.
Yeah, there's a huge amount to unravel. So I feel like we'll be on this particular topic around health for a little while. We've got quite a bit to chat about. But I think for the purpose of this particular chat, that is sufficient for now.
Yeah.
Just to basically introduce the idea of that it has been part of a long-term goal for a very, very long time. This isn't something new. But I think also it's important to realize and give power to the fact that for all of these powers that really are creating a war on humanity right now, that there's an incredible amount of people and organizations that are fighting for us and are fighting on behalf of all sentient beings. And I don't know that if the dark powers necessarily realized how strong and unified they would be. So from my perspective, I'm still definitely staying positive during this time, and also from my connections with the other side, I've also had information, I guess you could say, that there is definitely non-physical energies that are really fighting quite an intense battle on behalf of us right now. And the best thing that we can be doing is connecting to self, is unplugging from noise. There's so much disinformation. Don't believe anything you hear. Don't believe us. Go and do your own research. Have your own experience.
Be a true walking question mark.
Yes, indeed. Question everything. And like I've said a few times before, we're not here to provide answers. We really are here to help people ask the questions. And, you know, we don't know what we don't know often until we come time to question it. So yes, question everything, but also just seriously you've got to spend time loving yourselves and connecting to yourselves, and lots of meditation, clearing out the pineal gland, just really spending time and focus on wellness. And I will definitely be going into more about that in coming weeks and sharing various tools in order to make that happen. Mars, any final words before we disappear for the moment?
I'd actually like to leave it with some others' words. First is a quote that I've always remembered from when I was a teenager and I watched the classic movie The Princess Bride, and the villain said, "If you haven't got your health, you haven't got anything. Look after your health." And I'd like to leave with some other words, and perhaps you'd like to play the recordings as we tail out with the famous speech by JFK and Eisenhower before he left office.
Okay. I will make sure we find that and fade it in now. Such is the power of video editing. All right. Thanks so much for that, Mars, and look forward to chatting with you soon.
Yeah, it'll be good.
Indeed.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone at home for watching. A bit of a casual affair today. We realised we've just got way too much information to go through, so this really is a small snippet, but much more to come. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, be well and keep dreaming the good dream. Ciao for now.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment.